Welcome to the Nutrition Channel on RanchTV.org. Thanks for stopping by today. And we're going to give you just a little heads up on what you'll find relative to cow nutrition here on Ranch TV. You know, cow nutrition and the nutritional program in a cow-calf operation oftentimes is going to be in the top 3 in terms of out-of-pocket or overhead expenses in a cow-calf enterprise. So it's important that we make the right decisions. So here on the Nutrition Channel, you're going to find some videos on different supplements. We're going to talk about the importance of forage availability and quality, and several other things relative to cow-calf nutritional programs. As we think about supplementation programs in a cow-calf enterprise, oftentimes producers' primary concern is going to be with what type of supplement should I be feeding. Should I feed cubes or cake or liquid or tubs, or should I be feeding hay? And those are all important decisions, but truthfully, the success or failure of any supplementation program depends primarily upon the quantity and quality of the forage that's being supplemented. Whether that forage is rooted out there in the pasture as standing forage, or as oftentimes the case, especially in the eastern part of Texas and pretty much across the southern U.S., hay is going to be a big part of that program in the fall, winter, and maybe even into the early spring. So how can a cattleman know if there's enough forage out there in the pasture for those cows to get full every day? And probably one of the more practical ways is to observe the grazing behavior of those cows. If cows would have their way, they'll typically have 2 major grazing events, depending on weather and humidity and day length and those type things. But they'll typically have a significant event in the morning, a grazing event in the morning. Midday, if those cows are full, you ought to find them in the shade somewhere, oftentimes maybe close to the water, where they'll be ruminating or chewing their cud, processing, if you will, and further digesting the forage that they harvested that morning. And then typically, again, depending on the weather and environmental conditions, maybe late afternoon, early evening, they'll have another significant grazing event. So an interpretation might be, if you see cattle out there in the middle of the day hustling, and grazing, trying to fill up, maybe that's an indicator that those cattle are a little bit short on forage availability and are not able to get their fill on a daily basis. And then you can also read things like their fill. You know, if you look at a cow from her left side, that area behind her ribs and in front of her hip is a good place to get an indication of rumen fill. If she's really sunken in there, kind of drawn, that's maybe an indicator that she's not getting full every day on forage. So again, grazing behavior is a great way to tell whether or not those cows are getting enough to eat, and forage availability as well as quality is a huge determinant in the success or failure of your supplementation program. Another important indicator in terms of the nutritional status in a cow-calf operation is body condition score of those cattle. Of the cows especially. And so maybe that's a little bit longer term measure, but certainly as we evaluate body condition, that's an excellent indicator as to the nutritional status of that cow. Maybe oftentimes difficult if we see those cows on a daily basis for us to determine significant changes in body condition. So that's where somebody, when the kids come home for the weekend, maybe a spouse can go out there with you intermittently and look at those. It can oftentimes be a valuable appraisal of changes in body condition. If you're interested in learning more about body condition and haven't picked it up on this channel, if you go back to the main menu for this channel, we've got some video clip there wherein Dr. Gill and myself describe the body condition scoring system with video of cows describing that body condition scoring system. It's a 1 to 9 system, 1 being extremely thin, 9 being extremely obese. Well, we've talked about grazing behavior and using the grazing behavior of your cattle to know whether or not there's enough forage out there for them to fill up on a daily basis. The other thing that's always of interest, and we get a lot of questions from producers, is, well, what's the quality of the forage that I have out there? And oftentimes the observation's made, well, I got a lot of stuff growing out there, standing out there in the pasture. Is it good forage? Well, certainly this year is no exception. We've had a pretty good weed crop. And as we think about forage that's available and preferable to cattle, oftentimes the weeds, especially as they get bigger and more mature, are not palatable. And so while they may look like there's something to eat, in a cow's mind, that's really not something to eat. The other thing that we know is as forages, especially grasses, as they get more mature, they go down in quality. Fiber content goes up, and that tends to dilute then the protein and energy content of those forages. And it's unfortunate, but the poorer the quality, the less a cow can eat. And the higher the quality, the more vegetative it is, the more a cow can eat. And so it'd be nice if the poorer the quality, the more they could eat, but it just doesn't work that way. The more fibrous it is, the slower it's digested in the rumen, and it's kind of like putting water in a hose. How much is coming out one end is a function of how much can go in the opposite end. And so as forages get more mature, they begin to put on a seed head. As we think about our warm season perennial forages, that's typically late summer or fall. But as they put on that seed head, as coastal Bermuda grass gets mature, the quality goes down, the fiber content goes up, and so the more the cattle need to eat. That can really come into play, especially on young cattle that can't handle, they can't consume a significant amount of that fiber. So the limitation on forage intake actually limits the performance of those younger cattle. Certainly in the eastern half of the state of Texas, hay is a big deal in most cow-calf operations. Certainly as you think about the Bermuda grass growing areas, they can produce more forage in the spring, summer, and early fall than their cattle can, than a sustainable stocking rate of cattle can consume. And so there's excess forage that can be put up in the form of hay, and then that forage can be fed during that winter dormant period when typically the forage quality or the quality of that forage rooted out there in the pasture is either of such poor quality that it won't sustain animal performance, or it's simply limited in availability. If you're buying hay, one of the primary concerns that I visit with producers about is if you're going to buy hay, at least try to get an idea of what the bales weigh. As I visit with producers, oftentimes the number one question is, how much is it a bale? And these round bales can vary in weight from easily from say 700 pounds to 12 or 1,300 pounds. So dollars per bale that's a pretty easy cost to get your hands around, but there can be a 75–80% difference in the weight of those bales. So if nothing else, at least try to get an idea of what those bales weigh and maybe put that on a dollars per ton basis so you can compare apples to apples when you're comparing different sources of hay. And then, I think it's really advantageous if we can get some estimate of the quality, nutritional content of hay. It's very easy to take a core sample out of a lot of hay like you see here behind me. It'd be ideal to go in and take core samples out of several bales, but you might want to do it by cutting. But take a representative sample, send those samples into the lab either here at Texas A&M, or there's several other private labs around the country that do a great job. Get an idea as to what the nutrient content, protein, energy, maybe even the mineral content of that hay is, and you can do a much better job then of designing a cost-effective supplementation program to complement that hay that you're feeding in the fall or winter. And producers oftentimes have a lot of questions in their mind about what should I be doing about mineral supplementation, and I would tell you, quite frankly, amongst nutritionists, mineral nutrition is probably one of the toughest things to get our hands around. Mineral consumption by cattle can be frustrating. Oftentimes, the cattle, we think that maybe they need mineral and they won't eat it. Other times we think we don't understand why they would be eating it to the way they are. So there's a lot of science. The mineral requirements are well documented, but I would tell you, at least in my mind, range mineral nutrition is one of the toughest things to get your hands around. I think it's a good practice by and large to have a mineral supplement out there, free choice. Cattle don't have nutritional wisdom. In other words, they can't separate the need for phosphorus, for calcium, for magnesium, and quite honestly, a lot of the minerals, if we tried to feed them as a standalone, they are very unpalatable. They may be bitter, they may have a bad taste, and so even if a cow were to need it, she probably wouldn't eat it because of the bitterness or the unpalatability, the lack of palatability of that particular supplement. So we put things in a mineral supplement to enhance intake. One of those things oftentimes that we put in there is salt. So we put the salt in there to enhance intake, and at the same time maybe to be a little bit of an intake limiter. So I think it's a good thing to have a mineral supplement out there, free choice. There's different Mineral requirements as you go from east to west and perhaps from north to south. Mineral requirements and mineral content of the forage is different as you go from the Panhandle to the Gulf Coast and as you go from the Sabine River to far west Texas. And so I think it's important that you visit with a nutritionist in the area, be that somebody from Texas AgriLife Extension Service, maybe a nutritionist with your local feed company with which you have a good rapport, but visit with somebody about the needs and the mineral needs in your particular program and your particular cow herd. Certainly, you know, several of the indicators that we might look for, if reproductive performance is not up to speed where you need it to be, if weaning weight, milk production of those cows or weaning weight of those calves is at least not average for the area, if you're having health problems in those cows or in those calves, certainly I think one of the places to start looking as a fix would be to look at your mineral supplementation, mineral nutrition program. What we've done here is we've added a couple of more supplements, or actually creep feeds, to this just to make the contrast in terms of pellet size or cube size. The 20% cubes, the breeder cubes, and the cottonseed cake, the 38% cottonseed cake we talked about earlier, those larger pellet sizes or cube sizes are primarily developed for two purposes, mainly for larger cows. It's easier for a mature cow with her broad muzzle. It's easier for her to pick up those bigger cubes off the ground than it is some of these smaller pellets. And the other reason, again, is that we can feed these larger cubes on the ground to cows, replacement heifers, whatever the case might be. We've added to the pan here, we've added 3/8 weaning cube, if you will, or creep cube, and then we've got 11/64, the real small pellet here that you might see oftentimes used in a starter creep ration. One thing we know is we start these calves, especially if they happen to be naive to cubes or pellets, as we decrease that pellet size, we get better palatability in those young calves. Another place that you might see these smaller pellets used is in complete balanced diets for some of our smaller ruminants like sheep or goats. So again, feed formulation, they come in different sizes. You can get these cubes up to maybe as large as 1 inch in diameter, and again, those are primarily designed for mature cattle and to be fed on the ground. These smaller pellets, again, the smaller the pellet, we're typically aiming those at younger cattle, and or we're going to feed those in some kind of a bunk or a trough.
When we talk about selecting feeds and evaluating feeds, it's important to be able to understand and read the labels that come with these manufactured feeds or pellets or whatever you might have. Nearly all of them have the same flow, and it's kind of a regulated aspect as well as from labeling. But the first thing they'll normally always have on the label is the crude protein content. And that's a guaranteed analysis. Normally it'll be that or perhaps a little higher sometimes. But for the most part, these are formulated to be at or somewhere around that guaranteed level. If you notice on this tag, it's listed as a minimum of 12% based on ingredient cost or whatever. It may actually be cheaper for them to formulate a feed that might be a little higher than that in protein and still meet the other label requirements. Next is listed crude fat. It's also listed as a minimum. In this particular one, it's a 3% fat, which is kind of a normal range on fat content in a lot of feeds. Once again, it can range and vary from, if they're using rice bran or whatever, it may actually elevate the fat level in a ration above that. In beef cattle nutrition, that's not really a problem. When we get into issues in equine nutrition, then elevated fat contents and some other things may come into play a little more, but we like to know at least what that minimum level is. Next is a measure of fiber content of crude fiber, maximum level of, in this particular feed, of 13%. That refers to the ingredients that go in, and it's somewhat confusing now because of wheat meal, soybean hulls that have a fiber content that's not just indigestible fiber. So we really need to then, once we look at the fiber content on a feed, we also have to refer to the ingredients to know exactly what that's going to mean from an energy standpoint. Before we started using a lot of those feeds, the fiber content was a really good indicator of overall energy value of that feed. Now it's going to be probably lower than what the actual energy value might be in some of the feedstuffs. Once we have the protein, fat, and fiber, the next thing that would be listed in there would be the mineral content of these, calcium, They'll normally have a minimum and maximum level of calcium listed on the tag, phosphorus, salt content, potassium, and vitamin content on these particular feeds. So those are the ones that would be listed here on the label. As you look down through here, the crude protein, fat, fiber. Once again, those are indications of what the formulation guarantees as a minimum and maximum level. Below that on the feed tag, you'll have the ingredient list. And there's not as much restriction perhaps in that as would be in the actual formulation and calculation. But it'll normally list the main ingredients first, grain products. It can be descriptive in some of these feeds. If it's all corn-based ration, it might have corn listed, but it'll have grain products, molasses products, roughage products, and they can be from varying sources. That allows a lot of flexibility in the manufacturing of feeds to where you're not limited to changing your label every time you change ingredients in the formulation of a feed. And once again, the unique ability of the cow to take various feedstuffs and convert them into a meat product or milk product is something that is really advantageous to the industry. So it doesn't really matter what those particular products are that go into that ration, as long as these crude protein, fiber, and fat levels are met. The other part of this tag, which is really important and a lot of people don't pay enough attention to, is the feeding directions. It has specific directions on how that product needs to be fed, the rate that it needs to be fed, so that you don't get into digestive upset issues and other problems associated with misfeeding of those products. It tells you to feed at a rate of 1 to 2% or 2.5% of an animal's body weight on a daily basis. Now, in this particular feed, it probably needs to be fed daily. Some of the cubes and higher protein supplements can be fed less frequently, and very infrequently is when you get into the cottonseed cake, the 30% and higher type supplements. But always look at that feeding directions and don't assume that they don't know what they're talking about. It is correct. That's the way that feed should be fed. It's the way it was formulated to be fed, and you need to follow those directions. As we look at the feeding directions on this particular feed, it tells you a little bit about it, not only the ingredients up here at the top. When you look at the feeding rate, you can feed up to 2.5% of an animal's body weight on a daily basis of this feed. That means it has to have adequate roughage in it. And as you look at this feed, you can see that it has quite a bit more roughage in it than some of the textured feeds we had before. It'll have cottonseed hulls in it. It may have some other sources of fiber. That fiber is necessary for that animal to sustain microbial populations in that rumen and still allow them to function and not get acidotic as they consume large quantities of this. The maximum amount they could probably consume of this feed would be around 3% of their body weight. So the recommendations are to feed somewhere between 1 and 2.5, and the reason you can feed that much as a percentage of their body weight is the fact that this particular feed has adequate roughage in it to meet that rumen requirement. Here we have a couple of different labels than what we've been looking at. Once again, we have the crude protein, crude fat, crude fiber, and mineral content of that. But also notice under crude fiber, or crude protein, excuse me, that it has to list if there's any non-protein nitrogen sources as a component of that crude protein. In this particular case, it includes not more than 7% equivalent non-protein nitrogen in that crude protein value of 26%. Also notice on the label it says for ruminants only. That goes back to feeding a feed for its intended purposes. Ruminant animals have the unique ability to recycle nitrogen and utilize non-protein nitrogen in the digestive process, and that's why we can add moderate levels of non-protein nitrogen to these feeds and very effectively utilize them in beef cattle rations. So there's nothing wrong with non-protein nitrogen. If you see that on the label, that's absolutely acceptable in beef cattle ration formulation. And this is a range mix that can be fed at full feed to those cattle. In fact, that is the feeding directions for this particular product. So look underneath the name of a product, it'll always tell you what class of cattle or animal it's used for. If it's restricted to ruminants, it'll have that on the label. And under protein, it'll always have the listing of any non-protein nitrogen that might be in that feed as well.
Well, why is it important that we don't feed those other those feeds for other species to our livestock. The reason being is because of BSE concerns. There are certain feeds that can contain mammalian proteins, such as pig feed and chicken feed and horse feed, and we don't include those mammalian protein into our cattle feed. So it's very important when you go to purchase your feed that you look and make sure you feed the appropriate feed to your cattle. You want to read the label on that feed and make sure that feed is appropriate to be fed to cattle and not other species.
Well, here's another good example of feeding feeds for their intended use and a reason why we would want to stay within the label. This happens to be a broiler starter, but notice here it has a coccidiostat, amprolium, and it has an antibiotic in there as well. And so again, this feed was formulated for starting chickens, and so consequently it's got that coccidiostat in it, which we might have a coccidiostat in other ruminant feeds. It would quite likely be a different coccidiostat than this one, but again, this is a feed formulated for chickens. It's got a couple of specific ingredients in there, namely the coccidiostat and an antibiotic that are labeled for use in chickens and not approved perhaps in other species. One of the things that you've heard us talk about several times is Dr. Gill and I and others talk about nutrition and comparing supplements. We oftentimes talking about comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges. And so we talk about comparing supplements, especially on a dollars per pound of nutrient basis. So what we wanted to do today is just take a very quick, very simple example and show you how simple it is to do those mathematical calculations so that we can calculate dollars per pound, in this case, dollars per pound of crude protein. So we've got two examples up here on the board that I just made up, fairly real world prices. We've got whole shell corn at $200 a ton, which is going to have about 10% crude protein on a typical basis, dry matter basis. And then we've got, on the other hand, we've got cottonseed cubes that we put in here at about 40% protein on an as-fed basis. And we got those valued at $340 a ton. So the first thing that we have to do in any of these comparisons is we have to figure out how many pounds of crude protein there are in a given quantity of feed. And so this, in this example, since we have them both on a per ton basis, all you do is you multiply the 10%, multiply 10% times the 2,000 pounds to find out how many pounds of protein there are in a ton of corn. And we find out that if you multiply 10 times 2,000, we find out that there's in effect 200 pounds of crude protein per ton of corn. Okay? Okay, to do the same calculations for the cottonseed cubes, we take the 40% crude protein content, multiply that by 2,000 pounds per ton, and we find out that there's 800, in this case, 800 pounds of crude protein per ton of these particular 40% protein cottonseed cubes. And so if we've got then, now we have this, we've got them on the same basis, 200 pounds of protein per ton of corn, 800 pounds of crude protein per ton of cottonseed cubes. So then we take the price. In this case, it's going to work out nicely. $200 per ton divided by the 200 pounds. And we find out that that works out to, in this hypothetical example, essentially $1 per pound of crude protein. Simple enough. So in this case, then we take the $340 per ton divided by the 800 pounds of protein. Find out that comes out to about 42.5 cents per pound of crude protein. So now we can compare those two feeds on an apples to apples basis. If we're looking at protein supplementation, we find out that the protein in corn is costing us $1 a pound. The protein in the cottonseed cubes, in this particular example, 42.5 cents per pound. And you can do that for any nutrient. We did this for protein. You could do it for energy. You could use TDN content. You could do it for the minerals. You can do it for any particular nutrient. But this allows you to identify the primary limiting nutrient for a supplementation program and then you can go in and compare feeds on a dollars per pound of that nutrient basis to help you make a more economical decision in terms of what will be the most cost-effective supplement to meet that first limiting nutrient. Typically in a range cow operation, protein will oftentimes be the first limiting nutrient. And again, back to that uniqueness of the ruminant animal, we know that as the dietary crude protein level goes below 7%, that animal, the rumen environment and the bacteria are starved for nitrogen. So oftentimes if we can supply supplemental nitrogen in the form of protein, it enhances that bacterial population's ability to grow at maximum rate and therefore help digest that forage at the maximum rate. So oftentimes a small amount of supplemental protein to a protein deficient forage diet will not only boost protein intake, but it boosts energy intake by at the same time increasing overall forage intake for that particular animal. Typically in a range cow operation, protein will oftentimes be the first limiting nutrient. And again, back to that uniqueness of the ruminant animal, we know that as the dietary crude protein level goes below 7%, that animal, the rumen environment and the bacteria are starved for nitrogen. So oftentimes if we can supply supplemental nitrogen in the form of protein, it enhances that bacterial population's ability to grow at maximum rate and therefore help digest that forage at the maximum rate. So oftentimes a small amount of supplemental protein to a protein deficient forage diet will not only boost protein intake, but it boosts energy intake by at the same time increasing overall forage intake. So a lot of producers may look at this and say that's well and good. We know it's a typical situation. The higher the protein content in a supplement, in terms of all natural protein, typically the cheaper that protein is going to be on a dollars per pound of protein basis. And so the next question that may oftentimes be asked by producers is, well, how do I know how much protein a particular animal needs? And certainly we know that the nutrient needs, in this case protein, we know that nutrient needs change during the physiological calendar that cow goes through during her production year. As we move from mid-gestation to late gestation, we know that nutrient needs, be it protein, energy, and minerals, all of those rise, because we know the two periods of greatest nutrient demand are late gestation and the first half of lactation. And so as we move into late gestation, that last 90 days of pregnancy, about 75 to 80% of the fetal growth occurs in that last 85 to 90 days of pregnancy. So there's tremendous nutrient demand, a tremendous rise in nutrient demand in that last third of pregnancy. And then the first half of lactation, lactation also comes with a significant nutrient demand. And so we've got that 6-7 month period of time in there where we got tremendous rise in nutrient demand on that particular cow. And then as we go through weaning, back into mid-gestation, nutrient demand drops off. But a good rule of thumb is protein requirement on a daily basis, pounds of crude protein for a cow over her annual production cycle is going to range probably from somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.4, 1.5 pounds per day up to maybe as much as 2.5, 2.75 pounds per day, depending on genetic potential for milk production, her body size, her age, whether or not we're trying to make a change in body condition or manage body condition. All those factors come into play there. But somewhere in that 1.5 to 2.5 pound range is a pretty good rule of thumb for daily protein demand by a beef cow. Well, here we are today at Producers Co-op in Bryan, Texas, an excellent backdrop for this segment on nutritional requirements of cattle and feed formulation. What we've got here is two different supplements that are very, very commonly used in the cow-calf, weaning calf programs. On your left, on my right, is going to be what we typically refer to as a cottonseed cake. On your right is going to be a typical 20% breeder cube. Probably two of the more common feeds that we use a lot of them across Texas in the fall, winter, and early spring. And though they may look somewhat similar, they're really two totally different supplements. I guess first we could talk about the 20% breeder cube, a product that's made by virtually every feed company that's making a pelleted or a cubed feed. Runs about 20% crude protein, very, very general use type supplement. We see a lot of that used, especially on cows in the wintertime. It's an excellent energy source. It's called a breeder cube because oftentimes we use that to try to hold, or maybe even in some more severe situations, try to put some condition on cows to get them in that body condition score of a 5 or 6 at calving, so that we can maximize the chances of getting them rebred. So that cube is an excellent source of protein and energy, hence, and we know the correlation between nutrition and reproductive performance. The cottonseed cake, on the other hand, the reason we call it a cake is because several decades ago, when the cottonseed oil mills were making or were extracting the oil, it was a pressed process where they would take the whole seed, press the oil out of it, and then the remaining meal would have a little bit of oil left in it, and they would press that out into large pans, much like a brownie pan. And then that would then be broken up and put in a burlap bag, and so it was called cake. That's a name that's just kind of stuck with it. It's really a cube, as you can see. A tremendous source of protein. We know that cottonseed meal is an excellent source of all natural protein. These particular cubes, I think here at Producers, run about 38% protein. Excellent source of protein, all natural protein. One of the unique things about them, because of the ruminant's ability to recycle nitrogen, we know that we can feed those cottonseed cubes or any high all-natural protein supplement. We can feed those as infrequently as once a week if that fits our feeding program, and still get good use by cows grazing dormant winter forage or on hay. Oftentimes, the cottonseed cake is going to be the cheapest source on a dollars per pound of protein, of natural protein, that we have available to us in a cow-calf enterprise. So, two feeds that look somewhat similar maybe to the novice person that's evaluating feeds, essentially a twofold difference in protein content, but both of them very commonly used feeds in a cow-calf enterprise. What we have here is cottonseed hulls. It's the hull, or the seed coating, if you will, off of the cotton seed. It's an excellent feedstuff, although it's not very nutrient dense. It's very low in protein. Probably those hulls are probably going to be in the neighborhood of 4 or 5% crude protein. Very low in energy, very low in mineral content, but it brings some very unique features to either pelleted feeds or textured feeds. One of the neat things about cottonseed hulls, even though they're relatively low in nutrient content, they are very palatable to ruminant animals. They like to eat them. The other thing that's great about cottonseed hulls, they're an excellent source of fiber as we think about preparing textured feeds. They have a unique ability to maintain the integrity of a textured feed. So as we try to hold all the vitamin mineral package, maybe the energy source, the protein source, is it typically going to be in a meal form. The cottonseed hulls do an excellent job of maintaining the integrity. They're palatable. They're an excellent fiber source. Oftentimes, because of competition from other industries, the price on them on a dollars per pound of nutrient basis may be somewhat expensive relative to some of the other ingredients that we have, but those unique characteristics of palatability and maintaining integrity of mixed products, they bring a whole lot to the table, if you will, as we think about preparing ruminant supplements or complete balanced diets. Two of the most common protein supplements that we use, or protein ingredients that we use, would be cottonseed meal and soybean meal. And you can see there's obviously a big difference in the color of those. Again, the cottonseed meal is the meat, if you will, of the seed. We talked earlier about the hull that's removed. The oil is oftentimes extracted. The cottonseed oil has many, many uses, and that would leave then the meat of that seed being the cottonseed meal. Both of these are tremendously high in protein content, something over 40% crude protein on a dry matter basis. Very, very excellent sources of protein in a cattle diet for all classes or all ages of cattle. Oftentimes in the southern U.S., soybean meal doesn't come into cattle rations simply because of a freight and a cost issue. Obviously, the swine and the poultry industries are big competitors for soybean meal and are not competitors. They don't use any cottonseed meal in the swine or the poultry industries. So great sources of protein. Oftentimes those are used. Cottonseed meal, again, the predominant one in the southern U.S. in terms of formulating either complete balanced diets for cattle or for supplements. Okay, what we've got here is a couple of co-products. Hopefully you can see the differences in these. We just left them in the bag so they'd be a little easier to handle. On your left is wheat midds, a very unique product of the wheat milling industry. One of the things that it really brings to the supplement manufacturing process is its unique ability to kind of hold pellets together, if you will. It's a good source of energy, decent source of protein, runs somewhere around 14% protein on those wheat midds. Oftentimes they can get quite expensive, but nevertheless they bring that unique ability to the formulation to hold that pellet together. In the middle we have soy hulls, and this is just the loose hulls. Sometimes you may find those in pellets or kind of crumbles. And soy hulls oftentimes get a bad rap because they get thrown into the same category with rice hulls or peanut hulls or cottonseed hulls. And they're really totally separate and apart from those in terms of nutrient content. Soy hulls will run somewhere in the low teens, 13, 14% protein. But the unique thing about soy hulls that they bring to the feed is they bring an excellent source of energy. On an energy basis, dry matter energy basis, that you can substitute those about 1-for-1 with whole corn. The unique thing though is they bring a non-carbohydrate source of energy. So we could actually put, if you put the same amount of energy in a rumen or in a ruminant via soy hulls or corn, we wouldn't expect the digestive upsets maybe as we get the higher levels of energy. So soy hulls, even though the hulls is in the name, we need not confuse them with the other hulls as in cottonseed or peanut or rice hulls, because they're truly above and apart from those other hulls. And then finally we have some alfalfa leaf meal. Runs in the neighborhood, I think the nutritionist told us, runs guaranteed 17% protein. Oftentimes may get up closer to 20% protein. Brings tremendous palatability to a textured feed. Very unique product there, and as we know, certainly the nutrition of any plant, the leaf is going to be of greater nutrient value and nutrient density than the stem. So they take the alfalfa leaves, grind those up and make a meal. It really brings some palatability to a lot of starter rations or creep feeds. Three more co-products that we wanted to mention here while we've got this unique opportunity here at Producers Co-op. The three that we have before you here on your left, you have corn gluten feed. In the middle you have Distillers dried grains. And then on your right you have a rice bran. All of those are co-products of other processing industries. The corn gluten feed, an excellent source of protein, excellent source of energy. One of those that oftentimes we don't think a lot about, but it certainly has a great place in either supplements or complete balanced diets. In the middle, Distillers dried grains, a byproduct or a co-product, I should say, of the ethanol industry. If you look at a typical ethanol plant, they've got whole shell corn coming in. They make the ethanol, and then coming out the back of the plant is the residue that's left over. And the Distillers grains are a tremendous product. They're going to be somewhere in the mid to high 20s in terms of crude protein. They're an excellent source of energy. They've got a significant amount of fat left in them. Those can be pelleted, although we're in the process of improving our pelleting technology of those. They certainly don't pellet as well as a 20% cube or a cake or some of the other pellets that we've looked at earlier. But they bring a tremendous resource, and as we think about the ramping up of ethanol production, there's going to be certainly more of that Distillers grain product used or available for us to use in the livestock industry. Finally then, rice bran, a very unique product, runs mid-teens, 13, 14, 15% protein, very high in fat. Will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 14, 15% fat. It too is a very unique product in that it brings that energy to the table, to the formula in a different form other than starchy carbohydrates. It's a tremendous source of fat, so it's a great way to put some protein and a fat source of energy into a complete balanced diet or a supplement. So three co-products of other industries that we can, because of that cow's unique rumen environment, we can make efficient use of those in any ruminant feeding or supplementation program. As we wind up talking in our discussion on co-products, I think there's a word of caution here, maybe a couple of points to be made there. One is we talked about the Distillers dried grains. The Distillers dried grains, because of the ethanol making process, oftentimes those can come fairly high in sulfur content. So there's a word of caution there. In a complete mixed diet, probably not going to be an issue. But as we move to using things like distillers grains as a standalone supplement, or maybe mixed with another co-product as a feed, and we feed those higher levels, 5, 6, 7 pounds or more a day, I think there's a word of caution that would certainly be worth heeding, and that is be aware that there could be a potential problem with the sulfur content of those. The other point that I would make with any of these co-products is they come with challenges. They're very appealing because of the cost. Dollars per pound of nutrient, oftentimes they're very, very attractive. But the other thing about those is they come with challenges to include the sourcing of those products, the quantity in which you buy them. Oftentimes you're going to be buying those from a commodity broker, and you're going to be buying them in load lots, 25, 30,000 pounds at a time or less. They're going to come bulk. And so you're going to have the ability to unload those, store them, reload those to feed them or to mix them. Oftentimes it's advantageous if we can feed these in a bunk or in a trough as opposed to on the ground like we talked about with cubes. And so the final thing that I would say about them is they don't come with any nutritional support. If you are purchasing cubes, you have the backing of that manufacturer and access to their nutritionist in the event that you have a problem, maybe need a little bit of help. The co-products come as commodities, and so you don't have the backing of that manufacturer to go to in terms of help. Most of those don't come, as I mentioned earlier, they come bulk. You don't have the convenience of being able to back up to the dock at somewhere like here at Producers Co-op and load 50 or 100 or 500 pounds at a time. So they're not without their challenges. In our opinion, they certainly have a place in beef cattle nutrition.
We've talked about the guaranteed analysis on feeds that have a label on them. One concern we have with people using co-product or byproduct feeds is the variability in nutrient content of those products. They're not guaranteed to be a certain nutrient content. They're guaranteed to weigh a certain amount once they arrive. They will be within certain ranges primarily, but if you're formulating rations and you need to have a consistent nutrient value to that ration, you then have to go in and analyze those and know what the nutrient content of those products are before you go to mixing in rations. Making the assumption that just they were 30 or 20% protein last time, they're going to be 20% the next time, that's a very invalid assumption. They'll range anywhere in 10% in protein content. The sulfur level varies drastically in those products as well. The energy value may not vary quite as much, but it just depends on now with some of the other distilling process and ethanol processes are redigesting some of that in that process, so they're actually taking more of the energy content out of those feeds to where it's basically going to be a protein supplement with little to no energy value in those products. It's certainly much less than what we were accustomed to when we first started getting distillers grains in our industry. One aspect of the processing on these products, particularly distillers grains, that I'm aware of, as they further process that and redigest it, it actually concentrates the fat content in those feeds. So you get some really high levels or elevated fat levels in some of these byproduct feeds. So you just have to know that. If fat level and energy level is a big concern and you're not just going after protein content in a feed, then you really need to analyze those products to know how they're going to fit in the formulation of a ration or a feed for livestock.
As we continue our discussion on beef cattle supplements, I think it's certainly warranted here that we talk about the tubs as a category. And like we talked about with other supplements, there's a tremendous amount of variation in the formulation of those products and the nutrient content of those products. The success or failure of the tubs or any other supplement, as we've talked about, is going to be dependent upon forage availability. And again, whether that's rooted out there in the pasture and standing forage or hay, the success of these is going to be dependent upon having an adequate quantity of forage with as good a quality as we can get. The other word of advice that I would offer on tubs is I think it's absolutely imperative that you read the label. Like we talked about, Dr. Gill talked about with textured feeds and supplements, it's perhaps as critical, if not more so, in the tubs because of the diversity of products that are out there. Many of these tubs are formulated to be very low intake, from 1/4 of a pound, according to the label, from 25 hundredths of a pound to maybe 1.5 pounds of intake per day. And so they're designed, by formulation, they're designed to limit intake. That said, it's important to realize that this is probably not the supplement of choice if you're trying to make significant improvements in body condition, because the cattle physically can't eat enough of that on a daily basis. If forage quantity is somewhat limiting, or if forage availability is somewhat limiting, or forage supply is limiting, they can't eat enough of this supplement to offset or to make up the nutrient deficiency that they have there. The other thing, the tubs, you pay a premium for the convenience of those tubs. So I would caution you, as you're considering supplements, just to do the math, get them on an equivalent nutrient basis or an equivalent unit of weight basis, and compare those as you would in any supplement comparison. Compare your options there. Certainly they're convenient. Probably the two most popular uses of the tubs are for, number one, for those people that may have an 8 to 5 job 5 days a week and physically can't get out there to the cattle. There is peace of mind in knowing that there is some supplement available to those cattle. On the other end of that spectrum, perhaps, is the very large cattle producer that physically doesn't have the labor, the manpower, the vehicle fleet to get around to those cattle every day or every other day. And so again, there's the convenience of the tubs, they're self-limiting, and there's that peace of mind to know that there is some protein, energy, perhaps even vitamin and mineral supplement available to those cattle 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is just one of many examples of some tubs that are available. This one happens to be, I think, a 225 pound or 250 pound tub. Very dense product, as you can see. It's extremely hard. This would be one of the cooked tubs. There's several different formulations. There's cooked in the way of providing hardness in the cooking process, manufacturing process. Some have a chemical hardener that hardens those tubs as well. So again, it's the hardness of the product. As you can imagine, cattle come up here and actually have to lick that. They can't bite it with their tongue, with their teeth, so they just have to lick that product. So the hardness of that product is really what regulates the intake. And as we talked about earlier, there's a label there that gives you, just like Dr. Gill described in another segment, it gives you the nutrient breakdown much like a feed tag on a bag. This is a 3013 particular tub, and as you see, much like was described on the bagged feeds, the label here, again by law, will have all these different specifications. It starts out with crude protein. This one happens to be a 30% protein. Another thing that you'll notice is this says this includes not more than 13% equivalent from non-protein nitrogen. Oftentimes these tubs may have higher levels of non-protein nitrogen than maybe some of the textured feeds or pelleted feeds that we discussed earlier. And again, nothing wrong with that. Ruminants can make very efficient use of that, especially when the forage in the diet may be less than or equal to 7% crude protein. This one talks about crude fat. You'll notice that this one's formulated to be at least 5% crude fat. Dr. Gill talked about the normal fat levels in cubes or textured diets is going to be in the 2 to 3% range. Another benefit of the tubs is they allow us the opportunity to add higher fat levels. And again, fat is a very dense source of energy. Fat contains 2.25 times more energy per unit, per pound, or whatever unit you want to use. 2.25 times more energy than a carbohydrate energy source. So we can add some additional fat to these products, and that's a great thing as well. Most of these tubs are going to be relatively low in fiber. You'll notice this one says 2.5% crude fiber. So again, it's a very energy dense, nutrient dense source. The fiber levels are going to be quite low. And you see the rest of those ingredients there, the mineral specifications, the amount of salt, the trace minerals that are in there, potassium, magnesium, copper, zinc. You can read the rest of those. Much like a feed tag, it's going to have some ingredient specifications. Again, those are going to be very broad. They're well-defined categories, if you will, but it's not going to specify actual ingredients. Like this one has molasses products, hydrolyzed feather meal, processed grain byproducts. So again, that just gives the manufacturer some flexibility to work within those ingredient categories to formulate an excellent supplement. One thing I might point out here, this has hydrolyzed feather meal. And oftentimes beef cattle producers, when they see feather meal, they think inferior quality product. And that's certainly not the case here. When we hydrolyze feather meal, we produce a very protein dense Feed ingredient, feather meal will run somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80% crude protein. Not very palatable, certainly not a standalone supplement, not a standalone protein supplement. The unique thing about feather meal is that protein escapes digestion by the bacteria in the rumen. And it'll be digested in the abomasum, or the true stomach, if you will, low pH, and then those amino acids will be absorbed in the small intestine. So a very effective source of protein if used in combination with some natural sources of protein. And again, as we talked about feeding directions over here, it'll talk about tub placement. It'll talk about how many tubs per a given number of cattle, and again, the all important, the amount of tub that you would expect, that the manufacturer expects those cattle to eat. So labels very important on tubs, just like we talked about for bagged feeds. Here's a pallet of another form of supplement that is used quite a bit in the western part of the state, but certainly is a very viable option for many producers. These are what we call blocks, the small blocks. Most of these are formulated to weigh about 33 pounds. This particular block is a range supplement, 39% protein, so very much like that cottonseed cake, 38% crude protein cottonseed cake that we talked about on another segment. Again, one of the convenience of these is it comes in a 33-pound package. So you can back up to the dock here at the feed store, load those on the truck, get out in the pasture, and if you got two people, it works really well. Somebody in the back can just kick these out as another person drives slowly through the pasture. Again, intake is going to be limited primarily by the hardness of that block. And so again, visit with your feed supplier and to have some idea as to how those blocks are feeding, and likewise read the label on those. They come with a label just like the other products that we've talked about. I find that these are oftentimes particularly appealing to those folks, again, that can't get around to see the cattle every day. I also find that they're oftentimes very appealing to some of the older cattle producers that may not be comfortable getting out amongst a set of hungry cows with a bag of cubes. They're not really comfortable or maybe physically able to handle some of the bigger tubs that weigh 125 to 225 pounds. Another great thing about these blocks is if you're going to only feed once a week, this is a product that would do very, very well in that once a week feeding regime. You can put those out, you can scatter them out, put the appropriate number of out for however many cows for a week's, maybe a week's allocation of feed. And again, with these high protein, all natural protein sources, if they eat it all in a couple of days or 3 days, again, because of that ruminant's unique ability to recycle nitrogen, that program will work just as well as having someone out there perhaps hand feeding those cattle every day or every other day. And there's certainly some labor and some vehicle and fuel savings to be had there if that once a week feeding program will work in your management system. Again, a very viable option. Read the label on those, know what you're getting in terms of protein content. They'll range from essentially 20% protein to 39 or 40% protein. So again, make sure you know what you're getting, read the label, and know what the expected intake on those blocks would be. We continue our discussion and talking about feed label or feed tag information. This is just an example of a mineral supplement. And again, the big thing oftentimes as we describe minerals, we'll talk about a 12-12 or a 12-6 or a 6-12. Oftentimes when they use numbers in reference to minerals, what they're talking about is the calcium and phosphorus percentage in the mineral. And as you can see on this particular mineral, it happens to be about 11%, guaranteed 11 to 13% calcium and about 7% phosphorus. So that'd be what's oftentimes referred to as a 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio in that mineral. And again, like we talked about in another segment, mineral formulation changes as you move across the state from east to west or north to south. For example, in the western half of Texas where we have a lot of limestone-based soils, we don't need a lot of calcium supplement. Our forages are typically very, very high in calcium, and so it's not that we formulate minerals that are devoid of calcium, but oftentimes we'll feed like a 1-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio out there. Other parts of the state where you perhaps don't have a lot of calcium in the soil, maybe some of the higher calcium content minerals would do very well. The other thing that's of particular interest in minerals is the salt content. I think it's important that you pay attention to that salt content. This particular mineral doesn't have, this particular mineral has only about 10 or 11%. I think it says 11% salt on the feed tag. And I think that's important as you think about what the projected intake is. Again, read that on the label. The manufacturer will give you an indication as to what the projected intake is going to be. But some of these minerals, be they in a loose form, like you see in this sack, or they also come in blocks, typically a 50-pound block, they can vary tremendously in the salt content from as low as maybe 5 or 6% up to maybe as much as 50% salt. So I think it's imperative that when we compare in mineral prices, that we're comparing apples to apples and not just how much is it on a dollars per bag or dollars per ton basis. Of mineral supplementation, and we wanted to take this opportunity, and I think this is a great side-by-side comparison here, to dispel maybe the myth or the perception amongst some producers that, well, if I got a salt block out there, I'm doing a good job, and if I got a yellow salt block out there, I got a complete mineral program. That's really not the case. Cattle don't have a salt requirement per se. I think there's some evidence to say that maybe in times when conditions are, forage conditions are maybe dormant, fairly poor quality, there's a perception that feeding some salt may help drive forage intake. I think it helps drive water intake, and certainly that would help in terms of maintaining the integrity of that rumen environment. But again, on the left there you see a sulfur salt block. Again, it's just a combination of elemental sulfur and salt. The white salt block is just, again, pure salt. All of those are going to weigh 50 pounds. So again, exercise caution when you're handling those. Don't get your fingers between them. Certainly don't drop them on your feet. The iodized salt block there is just much like the same salt that we would use in human foods. It's got iodine added. And then a horse of a different color, if you will, on the far right there, the trace mineralized salt block that would include not only calcium and phosphorus, but many of the trace minerals such as copper, manganese, potassium, some of those other minerals that we talked about on the tag when we were looking at a bagged mineral. So again, salt's not a bad thing, but again, it can be a distraction to a mineral program. So one of the recommendations we would make is if you've got a good loose mineral, textured mineral program, you're not getting the intake that you want in that mineral. If you're also offering salt, try taking up the salt, be it yellow or white. Take that salt up, and most of the time you'll see an immediate response in terms of a rise in mineral intake. So another point to make on that trace mineral block, it is a combination of trace minerals and salt. And if you read the label on that one, it's 1.8% calcium, 2.8% phosphorus. So again, don't fall into the misconception that if I put out a trace mineralized salt block, that it's a complete balanced mineral program. It is a salt block with trace minerals added. Probably wouldn't supply the warranted amount of either calcium or phosphorus to a range cow.